Now, since the COVID-19 Omicron variant was discovered in South Africa, several countries have imposed flight bans and restrictions on Southern African countries and have now expanded same to Nigeria, Ghana, and Egypt. Now, there appears to be political undertones to these bans, or are they? Now, for greater focus on this and, of course, the implication of what is globally acknowledged as ongoing vaccine inequity at the expense of Africa, we're now being joined by Professor Chika Mordi of the African Studies Department at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. I want to say thank you very much, Prof, for joining us today. Now, let's talk about the bans. Are the bans and restrictions for this Omicron variant driven by politics?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Undeniably, yes, they are. And if you want empiricism, look no further than Argentina, which has imposed the most egregious of bans. What they've done is to impose a ban on all of Africa, the entire African continent, 54 countries. And here's a country with a very checkered past when it comes to racism or dealing with things African. For the more relevant countries, the Western countries to us, and obviously China, it's been a mixed pot. But again, it's very difficult to isolate politics from it. Why do I say this? The first factor is the Omicron variant has not proven to be as lethal as Delta or previous variants. In fact, there's not a single reported case of a death from Omicron as of yesterday. The second thing is, again, scientific fact, the severity of the disease and hospitalization appears to be less than Delta or previous variants. So there's no real basis for this ban without some political, insinuation, if you like. And obviously, the final thing is the variant was indeed sequenced in South Africa, but there is now increasing evidence that it did not originate in South Africa. In fact, Dutch scientists confirmed the existence within Europe before the South African sequencing. Now, have we seen similar bans to countries where it was found earlier? No, it is almost primarily an African ban.
Professor, yes, let's. Can we talk about the response by the African countries? What do you think? Do you think these responses to the countries, do you think the bans are adequate? And if not, what should be done by these African leaders?
Good question. It will not be uncharitable to say the response has been weak, and they could obviously do a lot more. Outside South Africa's president, who responded sometime last week on at least 2 occasions where he criticized the ban, there's been a very muted response. In fact, some African countries like Angola very quickly closed their borders to Southern African countries, in line with what the Europeans and the Western nations were doing. They should, in my opinion, have reacted more forcefully to this. The AU should convene a meeting, an emergency meeting of the key presidents, or the presidents themselves of pivotal states could convene an emergency meeting. They should leave that meeting with a communique that has very clear decisions. First of all, criticizing these bans and pointing out they're not based on science. Secondly, expressing their discomfort with this beyond just the regular diplomatic channels. They should communicate to the public this message that this is not acceptable. It has undertones of some racism or being stereotypical. There should be very clear actions against Argentina in particular because of the way they reacted. For example, I'm surprised that the Argentinian ambassadors have not been summoned in some African countries to come and explain the basis for their own bans. The third thing is obviously to reaffirm their faith in science and work towards practical solutions on the Omicron variant or indeed COVID-19 in general.
All right, Prof. Talk to me. Since we know that this should be the right thing to do, certainly people have proposed this to the leaders in the AU and some of the big countries here in Africa. What's the fear?
Well, many African countries, there's this issue of donor leverage. So if you look at some African countries, a lot of their budgeting, a lot of the financing of the healthcare and other aspects of governance is done by from grants from Western countries in particular. And sometimes they want to buy the hand that feeds you. So that might explain the reticence in coming out trying to forcefully criticize these measures. But it's a very misguided way of thinking, because as the African countries have much more power than they appear to recognize. And it's not just about economic power where you could decide who you buy from, but there's also the moral power. And in the publics in these countries, who are mostly democracies, there is a moral aspect of speaking out that will put pressure on the government.
Apart from the moral power, Professor, what kind of appropriate response do you think should be taking place?
So beyond, obviously, if bans are being put in place, what you want to do is to try to reverse those bans or to restrict some of the more difficult, if not unpragmatic, restrictions that have been imposed. Now, the WHO has finally, they've made some statements, and the evidence is coming out. At the beginning, what was being said was, we need more time to determine the severity of the virus and the lethality and to understand it more and vaccine efficacy. There's now sufficient time, and the indicators are pretty strong that it's not as lethal. It's not, in other words, it has lower mortality. Yes, it's spreading faster, but it's not as severe, so hospitalizations are lower. Now, it's, again, we can't escape this idea of politics. When you think about how the WHO is responding, if you guys remember, last year, you had a South African variant, you had a Brazilian variant. And when it happened in India, and India pushed back, they decided to label it, popular use of label Delta variant. This time around, again, once it's African, there's a reflexive action we tend to see, right? So this time around, this variant should have been called the XI variant, which was the sequence in Greek. The Chinese head of state's name is Xi. WHO cowered and skipped Xi to get to Omicron. Never mind their companies and products that are named Omicron. So it's down to international politics and how you handle that diplomatically and in terms of messaging and sending a narrative will determine how quickly those bans are moved.
All right, there is evidently a large disparity in COVID-19 vaccination levels between the rich and the poor countries. What is behind this huge gap we're seeing playing out?
That is a fact. And there are a number of factors. There's a significant disparity in terms of vaccination rates. So if you look at the global vaccine, the world as a whole, more than 55% of people have been vaccinated. For the poorer countries, of which Africa is one, low-income countries, that figure is 6.2%. For Nigeria, it's 3.1%. That's a massive disparity. There are countries like the Emirates that have 98% vaccination rates. And the reasons are down, first of all, obviously to money. The more income you have, the more your purchasing power of these vaccines. Right. The second thing is some of the countries, especially the US and the UK, paid in advance of the vaccines being developed. So they're being prioritized ahead of the rest. The third thing is, again, politics. There are countries like Botswana that have paid for 5 million Moderna vaccines, but they were deprioritized. And some other countries wealthier and more strategic to perhaps Western countries, we are put ahead of them in terms of delivery, right? And then the final thing, obviously, there's an effort, the COVAX effort, which Gavi, the World Bank, and the third party are trying to help with vaccinating the poorer countries. The delivery to COVAX has been slower. The pledges are increasing, but the timeline is not matching the delivery. So you're seeing that increasing gap between the rich countries and the poor countries. In fact, on a daily basis, last 2 weeks, the rich countries were having 6 times as much booster doses, as a third doses or second doses of Johnson & Johnson. So booster doses, right? 6 times first-time doses in the poor countries. That is an unacceptable kind of gap.
And we've actually been showing across our screens a number of European countries that have the Omicron variant, but surprisingly, they have not been banned. We've heard of no bans of travel in and out of any of these countries. Professor, what do you have to say about this?
That is the real politic about this. So it is realism in politics. They're pursuing interest, and for strategic partners and countries that are more important to them, they're not going to impose those bans. Obviously, some of them are within the EU, so it's more difficult to isolate EU members. But the reality is there is no scientific basis for singling out Africa in this manner. Yes, we could argue that perhaps the health facilities and detection facilities or capabilities might be less than Europe. But then again, South Africa sequences variants. South Africa has superior sequencing capabilities and facilities to many of the countries in the West that are not being banned. And their crime appears to be having that capability and having sequenced this and being transparent about it. So I think it's hard to morally justify these double standards. And I think African nations need to act and speak up forcefully about this double standards and near borderline stereotypical treatment.
All right. Okay. All right. Okay. Explain to all our audience this talk about vaccine diplomacy.
So the idea was, if you look at the vaccines that are accepted worldwide for travel, you'd find out 4 of them are American-based or collaborations between America and European countries. Right. So Oxford AstraZeneca is British-based with a European partner. Pfizer, BioNTech, you have a US-German thing, and then Novavax is local to US, and Johnson is based in Belgium, but it's owned by Johnson & Johnson. Now, China has Sinovac and the second one, and India is the world's largest manufacturer of vaccines. They manufacture AstraZeneca, and they have a branded version for India, and they now developed a local alternative. And finally, Russia has Sputnik, which has met, he's not had a particularly good run in terms of results and reliability. So these countries that produce these vaccines and that develop these vaccines have the discretion in determining who they send it to or who they sell it to. And even when people have paid, the companies and the countries can decide who they prioritize, who they deliver it to. And it's being used now as a diplomatic tool. So China, for example, announced they're going to give 1 billion vaccines to Africa in the wake of the Omicron variant. Right. The US and a lot of European countries have also been making announcements. Some of this is declaratory. It's not completely translated to the vaccines. So COVAX, for example, was planning to deliver 2 billion vaccines by the end of this year. They're not anywhere near that target. The last estimate is 1.4 billion in January. COVAX is not able to deliver that because the commitments are meant to come from these countries that I mentioned, and it's not coming as quickly. They focus more on their domestic delivery. So vaccine diplomacy is now using vaccines as a tool of political power.
Wow.
Okay, I want to say many thanks to you, Dr. Chika Mordi from the Johns Hopkins University, for your breakdown on this vaccine inequity and, more importantly, the ban on African countries. No thanks to the Omicron variant.